The Skit is a fabulous episode of Everybody Loves Raymond. This is the 17th episode of season 6. This is directed by Halvorson, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode chronologically and share some thoughts. And it starts off with Marie polishing silverware, and Ray and Debra are over there, and it's for Lee and Stan's 45th anniversary party. Frank doesn't want to write the tribute that he's supposed to be writing, so Marie manages to convince Ray, kind of just demands that Ray does it, basically doesn't give Ray a choice. And then we cut to the next scene in the kitchen at Ray and Debra's, and Ray is trying to write this speech, this tribute, and Robert comes over and they're talking about it, and Debra suggests that since Ray can't really come up with any funny or engaging stories about Lee and Stan, why doesn't he compare their classical marriage to Marie and Frank's? Because let's face it, there are many funny stories about Marie and Frank. He thinks this is a great idea, and then they suggest doing it as a skit and putting on a performance with pretending to be Marie and Frank and Lee and Stan. And Robert thinks this is a terrible idea. It's one thing to joke about them behind their back, but to do it to their face, this is going to be a disaster. Maybe. He suggests a parody song instead, and Robert gives a rendition of this song. It was a good song, but yeah, probably not as entertaining as a skit. Also, just as an aside, I'm now playing a new game called Find the Canister. I always play the Find the Branded toys. In usually the front room, there are a lot of Disney toys and other recognisable characters. I'm now also playing Find the Canister because it seems to be in a different place in the kitchen in every episode. And I won't say where it is in this episode, but if you want to play along, I'd rather encourage that because it's just a fun little game and makes it all the more engaging and gives me an excuse to look around the kitchen. I'd love to just go onto that set and look in the cupboards, particularly if I could go back in time, because there will be brands and packaging that we don't have anymore. Well, I'm in the UK, we don't have most of them, but things that we don't see commonplace today. So I love the kitchen so much. We're now leaving the kitchen though, as we are cutting to Lee and Stan's 45th anniversary party. Lee and Stan are played by Debra Mooney and Victor Raider-Wexler, and they're doing the skit. Yes, Medora, that's my cat. They're doing the skit, and it goes down really well. It starts off with a very gentle, calm impression of Lee and Stan, and they rather liked it. And then they do an impression of Marie and Frank storming into the house, looking through the mail. Ray unbuttons his trousers and pulls it. Well, I was going to say pulls everything out. Not quite. But he does an impression of Frank, and it's so funny. The impressions are brilliant. It's so well written. I absolutely loved it. And better than that, Marie and Frank loved it. It was a hit. Everybody thought it was fantastic. And then at the end of the night, everybody was getting ready to leave and everybody was still really happy. And I'm just thinking, because I couldn't remember, I've seen this episode, but a long, long time ago, and I couldn't remember what happened. And I was thinking, what's going to go wrong? Why is nobody offended? What's the problem? Because something has to happen. And then it suggested that Marie and Frank do something like that at Ray and Debra's anniversary. And they're encouraged to give them a preview of what that would be like. And it starts off, not the most offensively, with Frank doing an impression of Ray's nasally voice. And then Marie does an impression of Debra complaining that it's difficult to heat up a can of soup. And it just kind of snowballs from there with insult after insult. Now, to be fair, most of the insults were probably no stronger than the kind-hearted insults that Ray and Debra delivered for Marie and Frank. But I feel like maybe Marie's version of Debra was a little bit over the top, maybe a little bit offensive. It made Debra come across as, well, not a great person. But actually, I guess their Marie and Frank didn't come across very nicely either. So maybe they matched their energy. I think maybe theirs was slightly more offensive than Ray and Debra's version. But it definitely wasn't horrendous. And Ray and Debra think otherwise and they leave. They go back home. What we're left with is a room of people who thoroughly enjoyed Marie and Frank's performance. Robert was having the best time. He gave the best facial expressions, and I think it would have been funny enough, but Brad Garrett just really cranked it up a notch. His response, Robert's response to everything was just so funny. I absolutely loved it. And then the three of them, Marie, Frank and Robert, go over to talk with Debra and Ray, and they basically explain that they didn't like it. They thought they made fun of them, and they actually thought that Marie and Frank did that because they were genuinely hurt by the original skit. But they weren't. It's very clear that Marie and Frank could take a joke. In fact, Frank says Marie knows she's a pain in the ass, and Marie says Frank knows he's a pig with shoes. Which is harsh, but I think they have a really good point. If you can't laugh at yourself, what's the point? Now, there are fine lines between laughing at yourself and accepting things that you need to change about yourself. Sometimes it's better to acknowledge that actually that's not a great personality trait rather than just laughing at it. But I do think for the most part it's a really healthy perspective. If these things are true, and you know they're true, and you've never bothered to change them, why would you bother getting upset about it? Because clearly you're not that bothered that this is who you are. Because as they pointed out, Frank knows that that's what he's like. Marie knows that that's what she's like, and they've never tried to change. They don't want to change. So why would you get offended if somebody tells you that's what you're like? Now, as I said, I do think Marie's version of Debra was not completely accurate. I don't think Debra's complaining about heating up a can of soup. So I can understand why maybe they were a little bit offended because it's not as accurate. But I think the overarching message there of just being able to laugh at yourself and accepting who you are, and as long as it's your family and friends making fun of you and doing it in a light-hearted way, generally it's not going to be a big issue as long as they're not pain points. Again, I feel like maybe some of Debra's pain points were touched upon. Ray's, I don't want to say Ray was being too sensitive here, but I kind of feel like he was. I feel like, if anything, the only thing he should have been offended by was the nasally voice thing, because that's something he can't change. And maybe that's something about which he feels insecure. So picking on that would have been a bit harsh because it's not his fault. He can't change it. Whereas the other things, maybe. So I don't know whose side I'm on, but I do think Marie and Frank had the right attitude for the most part. And Marie even said, and I believed her, I genuinely believed her, part of me thinks she was being a bit manipulative with her words when she said, now that we know you're sensitive, we won't make any more jokes. On the one hand, I think she's being sincere, but on the other, the way she said it, now that we know you're sensitive, it kind of sounded like an insult, like she was trying to manipulate them to get them to actually come around to their perspective. And that's exactly what happened. It's very clear that Debra heard those words and didn't want to be called sensitive. The implication there is that they're overly sensitive. And she said, actually, no, we can take a joke. It's absolutely fine. And Marie and Frank are happy with that conclusion. And they leave. And then Robert made so many great facial expressions in this. I always want to put Brad Garrett's facial expressions in the thumbnails, but I refuse to because they always take me by surprise and they're always so funny. And I always try to avoid spoilers of any kind, including spoilers for funny things, because obviously somebody might click on this and not realise that it's full of spoilers until they actually listen to the beginning of the discussion. So I kind of try to avoid those. But I really want to put them in this. I really want to just put them everywhere because they're absolutely brilliant. And just as he leaves, he tells them to live, love, laugh. He leaves with a wink, and then his head pops up in the kitchen window as Ray and Debra are arguing. He's having a really great time, which is lovely to see. And then the final scene, Robert's putting away the silverware. There's a missing spoon. So he panics, thinking maybe it's in the trash. Maybe somebody, scraped their food or whatever into the trash and put the spoon in. And he's digging through this trash with his bare hands, just as we see Ray popping up in the kitchen window with a spoon on his nose. Robert turns around and sees him with his hands covered in goodness knows what, and it was just an absolute joy. Such a funny episode. My highlights are completely just Marie, Frank and Robert. They were all just absolutely fantastic. Ray and Debra were great as well. Their skit was fabulous. It was a risk, but because Marie and Frank are comfortable with who they are and can laugh at themselves, they took it in good humour. I do feel like doing a skit of somebody when you're technically insulting them is a risk if you're not sure that they're confident about those personality traits. But Marie and Frank clearly are. Whereas maybe Debra and Ray have some of their own issues to work with. And maybe, apart from the nasally voice thing, I guess the rest of them can be adjusted. But again, Debra doesn't complain about heating up a can of soup. At least in my recollection, I don't think she ever has. So maybe Marie and Frank were a tiny bit harsher than they needed to be, but it's still a fabulous episode. And Robert's face just throughout the entire thing. Absolutely fabulous. The Skit is a wonderful episode of Everybody Loves Raymond.